Well, Altus had some transport aircraft there, but they had primary purpose was the 11th Air Refueling Squadron KC-135s. And I don't know exactly how many planes we had. I think it was about 20 aircraft, but we had 26 crews. And the crews were numbered based on seniority and ability, supposedly. The colonel said that he'd heard some good things about me. I don't know where in the world he heard them, but I'm glad he did. But he said that he was going to assign me to crew S-101. Well, like I say, there was 26 crews, so the crews were numbered S-101 all the way to S-126. And he said the 101 crew is our standardization and evaluation crew. Those are the people that are responsible for training and keeping proficient all of the other crew members, the pilots, the co-pilots, the navigators, and the boom operators. My last year and a half that I spent in the Air Force, early 1970, I was assigned to fly AC-119G gunships in Vietnam, and I was a little nervous about it, but I was excited at the same time because I was actually going to get to go see some war action. They had a klaxon that was the alert bell would go off, and you had exactly 5 minutes to get from wherever you were and doing whatever you were doing to get out and be on that airplane ready for the next order, which was either start your engines and take off and go to war, or this is just a practice, go back inside. I had one little incident that happened just about a week before we were supposed to graduate. We were just out flying solo missions where you just go out in a specific area that you were supposed to stay in at a certain altitude. Gave us about 5,000 feet up and down in about a 10 square mile radius just to go around and fly and have a good time, get some hours and get more comfortable in the aircraft. And so I took off and went out, and I was doing my little maneuvers and whisking through the clouds and just enjoying a nice beautiful day in South Texas. And all of a sudden I realized that I had missed the window to come back and land. I really need to back up a little bit, talk a little bit about my last year in high school, which kind of formulated what I was going to do in college. To start with, I transferred from Biloxi, Mississippi, where I went to Biloxi High, about halfway through my junior year, to Topeka, Kansas. And Dad was transferred to Forbes Air Force Base, and the school that was nearest by that all of the GI kids went to was Washburn Rural High School, and it was out in the middle of corn and wheat fields, so it was rural. But when we got up there, we sold the trailer that we'd lived in since 1955 and moved into base housing. And about that time, my dad bought me my very first owned car, which was a 1951 Plymouth, a very ugly and family-looking vehicle. He paid $100 for it from some old farmer that had it out in his field, and it was full of some kind of feed. So we spent several weeks cleaning it out, getting rid of all of the stuff that was in there. And actually we repainted it, and my mother sewed together a complete headliner. So I mean, it was a big job to get it back to where it was drivable and acceptable to a high school kid. But during that time, early the following year, my dad and I went down to where my grandmother Vanover lived in Bronson, Kansas. And my grandpa, who had passed away some 10 or 15 years earlier, had a 1928 Chevrolet. And it was a green with black fenders, but every one of the 1928 Chevrolet models were painted exactly the same. They didn't get a lot of variety. But we drug that thing from Bronson up to Topeka and set it in the driveway. and it wouldn't run. So my grandpa Barry, he had come to stay with us for a while. He worked around each one of his children, and he'd stay each one of them 2 or 3 months at a time and then move on to the next one. But he said, well, let's take the engine apart and let's fix it. And so we unbolted the engine. It was a 4-cylinder overhead valve engine. Of course, when we just started doing that, we realized the transmission was tore up too. But we hauled it down into the basement, and my grandpa and I took every single piece off of it, cleaned it all up, and put it all back together. The carburetor was pretty stopped up, so it took a little extra work to get it going. And we finally found a transmission somewhere in a junkyard up in Nebraska. So we drove up there and got that and brought it back. And when we got it all completely apart, I said, okay, Grandpa, what are we going to fix on this? He said, well, we're not going to fix anything. We're just going to put it back together. I just wanted you to take it apart so you'd know how to do this. So I said, okay. So we put it all back together. Sure enough, it ran. In fact, it ran pretty good. The only problem, it couldn't stop. It had mechanical brakes, and the brakes the front left one would grab one time, and the rear right one would grab the next time, and occasionally none of them would grab. So it was kind of a danger to itself. We never did get it licensed. I just kept it in the driveway, and every once in a while I'd take it out on a back road behind the base housing and drive it around a little bit and then bring it back. But anyway, so we had that sitting in the driveway, and here I am in high school, and I played a lot of baseball in those days, and I had been able to manage to get on a team called the Topeka Caps, and they were kind of a standalone team for Topeka, and we played other all-star teams all around the area, Manhattan and Lawrence, Kansas, and Great Bend and Wichita, and a bunch of towns that had all-star teams, and you had to be 17 to play, and so I played with them for over a year. But anyway, so back to my high school days, I was out. My big sport then was gymnastics, and I was a performer on the high bar. In fact, I had an opportunity to do a performance for an entire high school assembly. It was a basketball game, and we were the halftime show. And so I did my performance, and everything turned out really good. The guy that followed me in that performance was better than I was by far. And so he got on the high bar and started doing this, that, and the other. And he fell off and broke his wrist. So I was the better of the two that day. But anyway, so finished up high school, graduated. My grades were pretty decent for what it had been in the years and years before that. And so once I got out of high school, in fact, I didn't even go to my high school graduation. I had a baseball game that night, and I said, well, baseball's more important than school because I'm done with school. And so I went and played my game, and they mailed me my certificate. So summer comes along, and I'm still playing ball. And my dad set me down one day. It was, not 3 weeks after I'd graduated from high school. And he says, well, son, what are you going to do now? And I looked at him with a straight face, and I said, well, Dad, I'm going to college. And he kind of chuckled a little bit, and he says, I don't think you're going to make it in college. I think you're going to drop out. And he said, I'm going to give you some advice because I'm on the inside of the information about this Vietnam thing. It is picking up, and they're drafting people, and they're going to be sending lots and lots of people to Vietnam to fight the communists. And he said, if you drop out of college, then you're going to end up in a foxhole in Vietnam. And I said, well, what if I don't drop out? I'm gonna go ahead and finish my 4 years and get my degree. He said, the day that you graduate from college, they're going to send you your draft notice, and you're still going to end up in a foxhole in Vietnam. And I said, well, what's my choices? He said, well, do me one favor if you're going to try this college thing. He said, sign up for ROTC. And he says, if you do that and you do graduate, then you won't be in a foxhole in Vietnam. I said, well, my daddy's never given me any bad advice, so I'm going to follow what he says. So I signed up for ROTC. School got started, and unfortunately, some of my high school buddies that all played football, basketball, and all the sports at Washburn Rural, the 2 or 3 of us that all hung out together, and we ended up spending the summer running around like typical teenagers. We used to, one of the main places we went to was a McDonald's, one of the early efforts at McDonald's. It looked more like a Sonic than it looked like a McDonald's. And you would cruise around the building and, wave at the girls, and the girls would wave back. And of course, the cooler the car you had, the more waves you got. And so the group decided right away that they were not going to ride in my 51 Plymouth. But one of my buddies, a guy named Tommy Hawks, his dad managed a lumber yard, and Tommy went to work in the lumber yard for the summer. His dad bought him a brand new 1962 Chevrolet Impala convertible, bright red, and so that's the vehicle that we rode in, and we'd chip in $1 or $2 for gas, every weekend. But that was what our fun was. And of course, it came time for school, and I had convinced Tommy and then another friend of mine, a guy named Gene Smith, for us all to go to college, and we would become superstars. Otherwise, we would end up getting drafted, and we were going to be in a foxhole in Vietnam. So we all started school, and unfortunately, my major turned out to be student union. I went to some of the classes. Of course, ROTC was one of them where you didn't want to mess up, so I went to every one of those. Some of the other classes was hit and miss. And so I got through the first semester with really not too good of grades and not too many credits from it, but I got through it. Well, my dad was at the time getting ready to retire from the Air Force after 22 years, and they decided to move to Fort Worth, Texas, because they didn't like the cold weather of the north. And there was an Air Force base, Carswell Air Force Base there, where Dad could exercise his hospitalization and his commissary privileges. And it was just a nice town and nice weather. So my dad retired, and they put me in a dormitory at Washburn University. And so, again, the next semester started, and again, I even went to less classes than I did before. I remember one break we got, Easter break, had like a week off, and my dad and mom had bought me a passenger train ticket from Topeka to Fort Worth, and that was the longest 20 hours I ever spent in my life. We stopped at every little jerkwater town between those two places, and it just took forever. And you didn't have time to get off. They just let the passengers on and let them off, and they'd go on to the next stop. So anyway, 20 hours later, I ended up at Fort Worth and spent 4 or 5 days and got some decent meals. And then got back on the train, went back to Topeka and back to Washburn University, which, again, I did not do extremely well. My biggest problem was just not going to class. But one of the highlights of my year was I played a lot of ping pong, among other sports, and I was a pretty good ping pong player. I played with a kid that was out at the air base at Forbes, and he was better than I was. And we would play a couple hours every day, and he would generally beat me every time, but he's taught me how to play better, because I had to be better to even get close to him. So I was at the student union one day, and here comes this guy, another military brat, and he's bragging about how good a ping pong player he was. It's not the guy that I used to play with all the time, but another one. And I said, well, I'm a pretty good ping pong player too. He said, yeah, I've seen you play. You're not bad, but you're not as good as me. And I said, well, I bet I am. And he said, what do you want to bet? I said, I don't know. You pick it. And he said, let's play for $100. Well, $100 to me in those times was like $10,000. And being a good sports person, I decided, well, I'm going to play him. I think I can beat him. So we said, okay, we're going to play in an hour. And that way it gives time to get ready and all this. I go back to the dorm, get my paddle. And so we showed back up there in an hour. And there had to be 100 people all stacked around the student union for this big ping pong game. Well, we played, and I mean, this guy was good, but out of some miracle, I beat him. And so I said, man, $100, I won't have to have any more money for the rest of my school year. And he comes up to me and he whispers in my ear, he said, well, you beat me fair and square, but he said, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't have $100. I said, well, how you going to pay me? He says, I'll tell you what I'll do. He says, I'll swap the tires off of my Pontiac that I'm getting ready to trade in, and I'll put those tires of yours on mine, and you put my tires on yours, which are almost brand new. I said, well, that's got to be worth $100. So we swapped, and I got new tires on it. And it was right after that is when Dad sold the car, and he sold it for $100. Same thing we paid for it a year and a half earlier. So anyway, that was the highlight of my sports life. And of course, playing for the Topeka Caps taught me one big thing, was I wasn't that good of a baseball player. I was much, much better when I was younger. Competition wasn't as good. But I realized, being a pitcher, that you had to be bigger and throw the ball harder than I could. I was like 5'10", but I weighed maybe 140 pounds. And the guys that were around me, pitchers, they were all over 6 feet tall and close to 200 pounds. And, of course, they can throw the ball harder because they got more arm and more strength. And so that was the signal to retirement from my baseball career. Well, school ended, and instead of having to ride the train back home, there was another kid that his family lived in Fort Worth, and he says, hey, you can ride down there with me. And I said, great. So we drove down and got to Fort Worth and rested for about a week, enjoying, the summer break. And my mom and dad come up and they say, hey, son, you finished your first year of college and you did horrible. What are you going to do now? And I says, well, I'm still going to go to college. I said, I'm going to enroll down here, and I'm not going to have any outside diversions or anything to keep me from concentrating on my schoolwork, and I'm going to do well. And they said, well, we can't afford to send you to college, but Dad said, I'll buy you a car, and that way you'll have a way to get there. But he says, you're going to have to work all summer to make enough money to pay your tuition. Well, he said, where are you going to go? And I said, I'm going to go to TCU. I said, that's the closest college. There was University of Texas at Arlington, and there was the Mean Green up in Denton, and a couple other schools. And I said, no, I'm going to go to TCU. I didn't realize that was such a prestigious school at the time, but that's where all the rich Texas girls went to college. And so the tuition, they thought that was kind of steep, but it was $10 an hour. And I said, well, that's $150 and about $30, $40 for books. And I said, $200 a semester, I can do that. So they said, well, get out and find you a job. Well, Mom, Dad saw an ad in the paper for a place called H&E Auto Parts. And they said they need a parts puller. And I said, well, I'm pretty mechanical. I know parts and I know, where they go and all this. I said, I'll go down there and apply. So it was right downtown, about a block and a half from the courthouse in Fort Worth and on Weatherford Avenue. And I went in there, and it was a really run-down old 2-story building that had stuff piled everywhere. And I told them I wanted a job, and they said, well, fill out this application. So I did. And then I sat down with the owner. The owner was a guy named Herbie Paul, and he was real heavy set, always smiling and happy and, shaking hands, just a good guy. And his brother's name was Eddie, and Eddie ran a junk store up on North Main where he sold everything from outdated floor mats to junk, but that's how they come up with the name H&E. And so I interviewed with him, and he said, well, I'll hire you. And he said, I'm going to pay you $1.85 an hour. And I'm thinking, boy, that's not much money. But I said, working at the commissary, I was making $5 an hour average, and I was working just on tips. So I said, okay, I'll take it. And so I started working there, and of course, I didn't realize how hard that work was and how hot that building was. No air conditioning, nothing. And around all of those tailpipes and mufflers and all the metal is so hot you couldn't even touch it hardly when you're pulling the parts. But I worked there, all summer and, made some money. But when I got my first check after I got hired, Mr. Paul had told me that I was getting $1.85 an hour, and I calculated it out, and I said, that ain't right. And so I had Mom and Dad look at it, and they go, no, you're making $1.15 an hour. And so the next Monday I go into work, I said, Mr. Paul, I said, I think there was a mistake on my paycheck. He said, what's wrong? And I said, well, you told me I was going to make $1.85 an hour, and I said, this comes out to $1.15 an hour. He said, I guess I didn't tell you that while you're on probation and learning the job, you're only going to make $1.15. But the very next week, I got elevated to $1.85. So I guess he assumed that I wouldn't catch it and just go along with it. But anyway, I worked there all summer, and everything was good. And it came time to enroll for college, and I went in and talked to Mr. Paul, and I said, I'm going to have to quit. I said, I'm starting college, and so I won't be able to work like I have been. And he said, well, wait a minute. He said, you don't have to quit. He said, I'm proud of you for wanting to go to college, and I want you to keep working for me, and I want you to work whatever hours you want to work. And he said, go sign up for your classes and come back and give me your schedule, and we'll figure out, what hours you can work. And I thought, wow, that's great. So I signed up for, I think it was 16 or 18 hours because I was trying to make up for the time that I had goofed off my freshman year. And it came back to where I could work like from 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 5 when the store closed, and then all day Saturday. And right after I started that regiment, Mr. Paul said, well, look, he says, you're going to need to get a commercial driver's license. And he says, we deliver parts to our other 2 stores after hours. He said, we pull the parts all day, and then we put them in this van, step van, and deliver them to these other 2 stores. And it takes a couple hours to do that. He says, so you can get more hours, get your commercial license, and you can have that job besides the one pulling the parts. So I said, that's even better. Well, it ended up I was working almost 40 hours a week because I'd work from 1 until like 7 every day, and then I worked all day Saturday. And the only day I had off was Sunday. And of course, school was really hard. I mean, like I said, first year I didn't do anything, and it showed in my second year. But I muddled through it and didn't have much time to myself, and I had money in my pocket. I was putting money in the bank. So anyway, so it turns out that everything was good there, and I had a good thing going on. And then all of a sudden, Herbie Paul needed a bookkeeper. Well, some girl came in there and applied for the job, and I noticed when she come in, I said, boy, that's really a cute-looking girl there. I'd like to get to know her. Well, he hired her as a bookkeeper. And so one afternoon, shortly thereafter, she was walking home from work. She had an apartment that's about 2 or 3 blocks away. And I said, well, I'm leaving now. I said, can I give you a ride? And she said, well, I'd love that. Thank you. And we introduced each other and talked on the way over there. Well, it kind of flourished from there on to a little bit of dating. We didn't have much time for that because of my school and everything. But her name was Nellie Jean Neuenswander. And so things led to other things, and we ended up getting engaged. And of course, my mom and dad said, no, you got to finish your college and all this kind of stuff before you can do that. And I said, no, this will work out good because, she's got a job and I got a job, so we'll have 2 incomes. And I said, it's going to work out good. Well, shortly after that, Mr. Paul fired her because she didn't have a clue what she was doing. She really wasn't a bookkeeper. She just bluffed her way into the job. So she had to go somewhere else and find a job. She ended up finding a job at Montgomery Ward Distribution Center, which is over on 7th Street. There's a big old 6 or 7 story building that was a 2 block square, huge. And of course they had all kinds of administrative offices plus the distribution center where they ship parts out to all the other stores. And so she went to work there. She actually made more money there than she was working for Herbie. But anyway, shortly after that, we got married, and we got our own apartment. The first place that we got was a little garage apartment, and it was the size of the upstairs of a small 2-car garage, and it was right off of the main drag on Camp Bowie. And it was $68 a month, all bills paid. And of course, they had no furniture. And of course, that went for a while because we didn't have any money to buy furniture. But we finally got enough in there to have something to sit on and sleep on. And so that's the way we went. And I would get up every morning and head off to school and work and stay in school till 1 o'clock or 12:30 and get over to the auto parts store and work my butt off there till close to 7 o'clock or maybe a little later sometimes. Then I'd come home and have about 2 hours before I was so tired I needed to go to bed. Well, it really didn't give much time to study, and which I wasn't the most conscientious person in studying anyway. But it turned out I couldn't even go take a crap without taking a book with me to read because I just didn't have enough time to do all of it. Well, anyway, I got through my sophomore year. My grades actually got a little bit better, and went into the summer. And again, I worked full time for Herbie at H&E, and started the next semester, my junior year, and that turned out better. I had pretty good grades, and of course, I was in ROTC, and I had a sergeant that worked there at the ROTC office. There was like 4 people in the office. There was a head guy, and then there was a captain, and then there was Jack Nystrom. He was a staff sergeant, and he was way too old to be a staff sergeant. He'd got in trouble somewhere and got busted, but he took a liking to me, and he was always helping me, giving me tips on this, that, and the other. And he told me one day, he says, "Hey, Vanover," he says, "why aren't you signed up to be a pilot?" He said, "You don't wear glasses, do you?" I said, No, I don't wear glasses. I get good eyesight." And he said, "Well, look," he said, "if you're going to make anything of yourself in the Air Force, you're going to have to be a rated pilot." And I said, "Well, nobody even talked to me like that before." I said, what do I do?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to give you some books to read." He went over to the school library, checked out 2 or 3 books, and one of them I had to go over there and look at because they wouldn't check it out. But it had tips on how to identify this and topography and stuff like that, where you could, have a little bit of knowledge about flying. And so he said, "Okay, I'm going to give you the test." And so he put me in a room, and I took the test. And I really don't know how well I did, but Jack Nystrom made sure I passed. And he came back about 3 or 4 days later. He said, "Hey, Vanover," he says, "you passed the flight test great." And he says, "You can either be a pilot or you can be a navigator." And I said, "Oh, I want to be a pilot then." He said, "That's a great idea." And so he signed me up for the to advance into the pilot training once I graduated. And so went the rest of that year. And while I was in TCU, I also joined a fraternal organization tied in with ROTC, Arnold Air Society. And so I belonged to that. It didn't have any meetings or, parties and drinking and all that kind of stuff. It was just a semblance of a fraternity. So anyway, I finished my junior year. Grades weren't great, but I was still, positive. I was on probation a couple times during my school tenure because if you got your grade point average below 2, which was a C average, you went on probation, and if you didn't make up that and get off probation, get above at a 2 or above, then you had to drop out. Well, I always managed to get just above, and I think I ended up with the 4 years. I had a 2.2 grade point average. But anyway, so here I am in the summer of my junior year, and two things happened. I got to go to what the ROTC summer camp. It was a 6-week kind of like basic training activities where you got up and did running and calisthenics, and you went to classes and more running and marching and inspections and all that kind of stuff. And of course, Jack Nystrom, he said you got to volunteer to do some extra duty thing to make make them impressed by you. And he says, so volunteer for something, no matter what it is. And he said, make sure that your shoes are shined all the time. And I said, okay. I said, but he said, you're going to get dusty and dirty and all that, and then they're going to have an inspection right after you get back from this run. So I figured out, I went down to some shoe store and I bought me a pair of military dress shoes that were made out of plastic. And boy, you talk about a shine, those things were shiny. And so when I went to summer camp, and it was down at James Conley Air Force Base in Waco, Texas. And I was there for 6 weeks, and they started asking, first as soon as we got there, they asked us, we have some extra duty jobs, if anybody wants to volunteer. And they named a couple of different things, and I'm going, boy, I don't want to do any of that stuff. And they were getting toward the end, I think, so they said, we need someone to lead calisthenics. Well, I raised my hand real quick. I said, I can do that. I'm in great shape. And so I got to be one of the squad leaders in the calisthenics, which meant at least one day a week I led the 250 people, or however many it was in our class, in calisthenics, jumping jacks and push-ups and all this kind of stuff. So I even got in better shape. In fact, the last day that we had the program and we were doing our calisthenics, I was the leader, and everybody went through all of the different procedures, and then we had to run a mile at the end. And I ran a 5-minute and 12-second mile, which at that time the world's record was 4 minutes. So I was really pretty good shape, and I'm glad I was. But it's kind of hard to yell out the commands for the other people to do push-ups or jumps or whatever, and talk at the same time, which helped me get in even better shape. So anyway, so we finished that program and came back, and I ended up number 3 in the ROTC group. So I had some title of executive officer or something like that. And a friend of mine named Gordon Blevins, he was number 1, and a guy named Mike Herndon, he was number 2. And so I was number 3, which I had been probably number 50 normally. But so we got through that, and then the nice surprise part is they said all of the people who signed up to be pilots and passed the test, we're going to get you your private pilot's license while you're here in ROTC, and we're going to pay for 100% of it. And I thought, wow, that's great. So we ended up starting out to Oak Grove Airport, which was south of Fort Worth toward Cleburne, and we had like 2 months to get at least 40 hours of flying time and pass the private pilot's license. And so I was kind of nervous about that because I had never really had the desire to fly. But I said, I can't miss up this opportunity. If I'm going to be in the Air Force, I might as well, be something that's going to be important. So I went down there, and they had a instructor that was overweight, smoked like a train, drank coffee out of a cup that hadn't been cleaned, they said, in 15 years. And from the looks of the inside, I think it was conservative 15 years. And this guy ate aspirin like they were M&Ms. And every time before he and I'd get ready to go out and fly, he'd reach in this giant jar of aspirin and pick up a handful of them, throw them in his mouth, take a swig of his coffee, and off we'd go to fly. And he said more than one time, Vanover, you're going to kill both of us after some mistake that I had made. And one of the worst parts of the training was you had to put the airplane into a stall and you had to recover from the stall. And that is the most scary thing that you can do in an airplane, is to make it quit flying. Because the first thing that happens is the nose drops and you start accelerating. And if you just pull back on the yoke to fly level, you'll break the wings off. So, it took quite a bit of learning, but I finally got it, and I passed my check ride and got my private pilot's license. So I was really proud of that. And so anyway, back to school, and I remember working one day. It was almost time for about the start of the last semester, and Herbie Paul, I was at work, and he come up. He said, "Well, how's school going?" I said, "I was doing really good." And I said, "But I'm going to have to quit this last semester." I said, "I've got to get my grades above the average I have now, or they're not going to let me graduate." And he said, "I'll tell you what, you cut your hours back and just work a day or two a week." He said, "I just don't want to lose you." And he said, "Besides," he said, "you see that guy up there in the front?" And that was the store manager. His name was Jack Draper. And Jack was way overweight, smoked like a train, and was always screaming and yelling about something. Something was always wrong. And sweating all the time and nervous. I mean, just a basket case. And he said, old Jack there, he's not going to be here forever. And I was thinking to myself, no, he's probably going to have a heart attack right now. And he said, he's not going to be here forever. And he says, you can have his job. And I looked up there and I go, the last thing, to myself, I said, the last thing I want to do is have that man's job. That's got to be the worst job in the world. I'd rather be in a foxhole in Vietnam, But I said, let me just cut my hours back, and I said, I'll work a little bit, but I really want to concentrate on my schoolwork. So he said, okay. He said, just whatever hours you want to work, you do it. And so I worked all day Saturdays, and I worked a couple afternoons a week. So it took about 20 hours off my work schedule, but at the same time, I was doing better in school. So come to time for graduation, and everybody had to go to a counselor and make sure you had all the credits that you needed and you were good to graduate. And of course, it was in the last semester, so there wasn't any time for, hey, you made a mistake or you don't have enough of this or that. If you didn't have it, you just didn't graduate. And so I went down, sit down with this lady, and that's the first time anybody in my entire college career had sit down and give me some advice on what I should do or not do. So she sat down and she said, I got bad news. I said, what's that? And she says, you're short one class. You need 3 credits in sociology or something. And I go, you got to be kidding me. I said, why didn't somebody tell me this before? I said, I've been taking elective courses in business, and I could have taken the 3 hours. She said, well, wait a minute. She said, let me look at it. And I said, and besides that, I said, the day I graduate, the next day I'm supposed to be commissioned in the Air Force and go to pilot training, and I can't miss that. And she fumbled around there with my transcripts and looked at it. She said, I'm going to move this course over to sociology, and you're going to graduate. So that was very fortunate. I hated to have that come to an end that way. So anyway, it came to the graduation day, and I forget, there was like 2,000 students that were graduating that day, and we walked across the aisle, and I was just overwhelmed the fact that I managed to pass that. But the one thing that my dad told me that made more of an impression on me than anything else, he said, don't start anything that you don't finish. Don't matter whether you need it or don't want it or whatever, you finish what you start. And that's what kept me going in college. There's a lot of times I had no social life. I had no life at all except going to work, going to school, and studying. And so it wasn't a real happy, days with partying and all that kind of stuff, except for the first year. But I managed to make up all those hours, and so went to graduation ceremony. We got graduated on May 29th. I forget, it must have been a Saturday or whatever, 1966. And I'd managed to get my 120 hours credit in 4 years. Of course, that meant going to summer school the sophomore and the junior year one term. So the very next day, May 30th, all of the ROTC graduates, and there was like 6 or 7 of us that were seniors and had graduated the day before, they had a swearing-in ceremony for us, and of course, Mom and Dad were there too for that. Besides the graduation, and I got commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. And along with the graduation ceremony, we got our orders, and my orders were to report to Laredo Air Force Base, Laredo, Texas, on August 1st. And my class number would be Class 66A. At that time, the Air Force had a fiscal year ending on May 30th, and the new year started July 1st, and we were the first class to start after July 1st. And so I had about almost 2 months off before I had to report to Laredo. And so I actually kind of goofed off a little bit then. I worked a couple days a week, even in that time. No school, but I just didn't want to put in all those hours again. And besides, I was afraid if I hurt myself or get in a car wreck or something, then I won't be physically able to go to pilot training. So I got to be really careful and cautious. But all in all, like I say, I am so glad that I had the drive to stay in college. Even though I didn't have the intelligence to excel in college, I got through it. That was the main motivation that I had to stay in there, thanks to my dad, and thanks to I guess a little bit of effort on my part too. Well, I finished my 53 weeks of undergraduate pilot training at Laredo Air Force Base, and I graduated. I was so thrilled about that and so happy that I had made it through and accomplished something else in life that a lot of people don't get to do. And had one little incident that happened just about a week before we were supposed to graduate. We were just out flying solo missions where you just go out in a specific area that you were supposed to stay in at a certain altitude. We had to give us about 5,000 feet up and down in about a 10 square mile radius just to go around and fly and have a good time, get some hours and get more comfortable in the aircraft. And so I took off and went out, and I was doing my little maneuvers and whisking through the clouds and just enjoying a nice, beautiful day in South Texas. And all of a sudden, I realized that I had missed the window to come back and land. The way they had this set up was the T-37s had 30 minutes that they could take off and land, and then the T-38s that I was in had 30 minutes to take off and land. And normally 30 minutes was about all you had enough fuel to do, especially if you were doing some more aggressive maneuvers and burning extra fuel. Well, I hadn't been burning extra fuel, but I had still used up quite a bit. And I said, well, if I go back now, they're going to have to shut off the T-37s from landing just to allow me to land, because our aircraft flew a lot faster than the T-37, so they couldn't have both of us in the pattern at the same time. So I said, well, I'm just going to stay up here and I'm going to pull back on the throttle. I'm going to conserve my fuel, and then I'll be the first one in the window when it opens back up. I had about 22, 21 minutes or something like that left. And so I did, and I just cruised around, and of course the fuel kept going down, but I was being as conservative as I could not to run out of fuel. And because if you run out of fuel, you have two choices. One of them is to crash with the plane. The other one is to eject and open your parachute and float down somewhere in the South Texas desert and hope they'll come pick you up. And then you'll have all kinds of problems filling out papers and explaining why you didn't bring that $1.5 million airplane back. So I, with all those thoughts running through my head, I had about 5 minutes before my window to land came back up, so I left my area and I got down to close to the base, and I called tower and requested permission to enter the pattern and for landing, and they gave me the approval. So I flew on around and got flaps down, got the gear down, landed, good landing, no problems, and said, man, I've made it. And so I taxied back to the ramp, and I shut the engine off and grabbed my helmet and my bag and headed back into operations, thinking, well, I did it, I escaped. And so I went in the operations room there, and where a bunch of us sitting around, everybody studying their books or doing something. And here comes this crew chief for one of the T-38s come charging in the room, yelling and screaming and cussing. And he He said, "Who in the world brought that T-38 back in?" And nobody looked up. Nobody acknowledged that the guy was in the room. If everybody would have looked over, the innocent ones, and then they'd have known I didn't look up, they'd known it was me. But they didn't. Everybody just kept their face in the book, and nobody said a word. And so he cussed for another couple of minutes, and then he walked out. And I said, well, he's probably going to go turn me in, and then they'll come find me. Well, lo and behold, never another word was said. So I escaped getting a butt chewing out, and maybe worse, but I got it back, but it was low on fuel. Have to say that. About a week later, they gave us a choice of what aircraft we wanted to fly after we finished at Laredo, and what location that we wanted to go. Well, me being a homeboy, I wanted to go back somewhere near Fort Worth, be near my parents and Nellie Jean's family and everything. So I put down first Carswell, and I think they were mainly flying B-52s at the time, and I wasn't really looking forward to that much because I'd heard so many bad things about the B-52. And my second choice was KC-135s at Altus Air Force Base, Oklahoma. And I said, that's only 3.5 hours away from home. And I said, really, I'd probably rather prefer to fly that aircraft because it was very similar to what all the airlines were flying at the time. And I said, I want to be, possibly an airline pilot later on. So I picked Altus and KC-135s as my second choice, and I got it. And so I was very, very happy about that. So headed off to training, graduate training, pilot training, and that was at Castle Air Force Base in Merced, California, which is about a 2-hour drive in central California, due east of San Francisco. Nellie Jean, she had been raised in Palo Alto, California, and so she had a few relatives still there. And so that was nice, to be able to go somewhere where we had at least somebody we knew around there. They gave me actually 6 weeks from pilot training to get to California. I had 30 days of leave accrued and about 10 days of travel time to get there. And I'd never had 6 weeks off since I was 12, 13 years old. So I thought that was wonderful. Of course, being a lowly second lieutenant, even though I was on flight pay, I was making like $525 a month or something like that. So we decided we would buy a tent and a couple sleeping bags and camp on the way out there. And of course, Debbie was only 6 weeks old at the time, but we thought, we'll be able to keep her warm and happy, and so that's what we did. We went up to Fort Worth and spent a few days with Mom and Dad and kind of got the car repacked and organized to head west. And then we took off and we went up through Panhandle of West Texas and into Colorado. And we got up to Colorado Springs and spent a few hours there looking at the sights because I had never seen the stuff out there, and it's pretty amazing. And then we got up to Rocky Mountain National Park. And we spent a couple of nights there, and we didn't realize how cold it would be, but we were 10,000 feet in the air. Even though it was August, it was cold, but we sandwiched Debbie in between us to keep her warm, and we managed not to get frostbite or anything and survived that. But then we went on up to Sheridan, Wyoming, where Nellie Jean had some relatives. She had some cousins, and she had an aunt that she was pretty close with, Aunt Nellie. In fact, she was named after her. Really nice old lady that very easygoing and cordial and very friendly to me and, to Nellie Jean too. And we stayed there probably for 4 or 5 days. And then we headed on west out and went to Oregon and didn't get into Washington State, but we got to the Pacific coast, and then we headed south on Highway 1 and saw some really beautiful sights and got to see part of the world that I don't remember ever seeing before. And we drove on down to Merced and we found us an apartment and got moved in. And then my school started, and of course my training was not to be a pilot in a 135, but to be a co-pilot. Well, a co-pilot's job was pretty simple and easy and straightforward, which I'm glad of that. But I got to raise the gear. I got to lower the gear, of course, at the pilot's command. And I also got to raise and lower the flaps when the pilot told me to do that. My main job to learn was the fuel distribution in the plane. The KC-135, which was a Boeing 707 without seats in it, weighed 100,000 pounds, the basic aircraft. And we could put 200,000 pounds of fuel on that plane. The job was to manage that 200,000 pounds of fuel so that we had enough to offload to all the aircraft we were refueling, and also enough left for us to burn in our engines and get back to the base we wanted to go to. The main thing was to keep the center of gravity right, and we had this big panel between the pilot and the co-pilot, and so I was constantly turning the pump on this tank and that tank. There were 7 different tanks in the aircraft, 3 of them in the main body and 2 in each wing. So we got to manage the fuel from that. You could pump fuel to the aircraft engines or offload in nearly every tank. So we learned all of that and finished all that. And when we had weekends off, 3 times we drove over to San Francisco. Nellie Jean was raised in Palo Alto, California, which is right south of San Francisco. And we got to meet an aunt and an uncle she had over there. The unique thing about the uncle, his name was Ralph, was that he owned a Rolls Royce. It was like a 6-7-year-old Rolls Royce, but that's something he'd always wanted to own. And so he found one used and he bought it. And he was showing that to me. He says, "Hey, would you like to drive it?" And I go, "Yeah, this will probably be the only chance I will ever have to drive a Rolls Royce." And so we got in it and off we went down the freeways here and there. And when they say that all you can hear in one of those in the inside of the car when you're driving is the clock, and that's a true statement, because you could barely hear the clock, but you couldn't hear any noise from outside. The thing was really well built and tight. So that was a thrill. I graduated from pilot training and qualified as a co-pilot in the KC-135, and they designated that the A model because it was the first one they came out with. And so we packed up, and our assignment was Altus, Oklahoma. And like I say, that was my second choice, and we were only 3 hours or so away from Fort Worth, so I thought this would be nice. And so we took off, and one of the things that Mom and Dad had taught me as we were growing up and moving around a lot was, if you ever go across a really, really hot desert, which Southern California and Arizona have one of those, is drive at night, because it's so hot, your car engine will run cooler and you'll be cooler. And so it's just a better way more comfortable way to travel. And so we took off at night. It was like almost dark when we took off and started driving. And of course, after it got dark and about 10 o'clock, Debbie and Nellie Jean both fell asleep, and I'm driving across this desert, headed straight east on I-10. And I looked up and I saw an unidentified flying object. And, you know, a lot of people think those things are made up. I believed that until I actually saw one. And what this was, it was a white light, and it just appeared from the far distance, and it moved across the sky until it was about 10 o'clock high straight in front of me, and it stopped. And I could tell it wasn't close to the ground, but I couldn't tell how far out in the sky that it was. But it's hovered there for about 30 seconds, and then it moved away rapidly. I'm talking thousands of miles an hour based on the knowledge I had learned in pilot training about how moving objects appear. And it stopped, and it moved back up to almost where it was the first time. And it stopped, and it just hovered there. And it was just not a real bright light, but a light bright enough that it didn't cause a shadow, but you could see it. And it's hovered there for another 30 seconds or so, and then it took back off east at a rapid rate. I'm talking thousands of miles an hour from my perspective, and disappeared. And of course, about that time when the thing is there, I'm trying to wake Nellie Jean up to say, "Hey, watch this thing." And of course, she woke up too late to see it, so naturally she thought I imagined it, but I didn't. And I still to this day say that I've seen a UFO. Anyway, that was the only excitement we had on that trip going to Altus. So we arrived at Altus, And fortunately for us, we were able to move directly into base housing, and that was pretty nice housing. I mean, we had, it was a 3-bedroom house, a 2-bathroom, small yard, but very well maintained and kept, and so we moved in there, and I reported to duty. I showed up at the 11th Air Refueling Squadron headquarters, and this colonel that was there, he greeted me. He said he was a squadron commander and welcome to the squadron, and that they're glad that I was becoming part of the 11th ARS, and he was going to give me my assignment, what crew I was going to be on. Well, Altus had some transport aircraft there, but they had, their primary purpose was the 11th Air Refueling Squadron KC-135s. And I don't know exactly how many planes we had. I think it was about 20 aircraft, but we had 26 crews. And the crews were numbered based on seniority and ability, supposedly. The colonel said that he'd heard some good things about me. I don't know where in the world he heard them, but I'm glad he did. But he said that he was going to assign me to crew S-101. Well, like I say, there was 26 crews, so the crews were numbered S-101 all the way to S-126. And he said the 101 crew is our standardization and evaluation crew. Those are the people that are responsible for training and keeping proficient all of the other crew members, the pilots, the co-pilots, the navigators, and the boom operators. And so I said, wow, that's a great assignment. I said, thank you for doing that. And I was very fortunate because I did have probably the best pilot in the entire base. He was a Major Garrison. And Major Garrison was a big old boy, about 6'2", slow walking, slow talking Southern boy. But everything he said had importance. So everybody listened when he said something. My navigator was a guy by the name of Andrew Lebowski. And Andrew was a captain, senior captain, and he had come from the coal mines of Pennsylvania. And when somebody asked him, says, well, how did you become a navigator in the Air Force? And he said, because my only other choice was working in a coal mine in Pennsylvania, and I knew I didn't want to do that. But he was really a nice guy, easy to get along with, a little finicky in particular about certain sanitation things, like he would refuse to drink out of the top of a beer can or a soda can because he said there's germs all over it and you can't get them off. And he was addicted to Alka-Seltzer. We'd come back from a flight every time, and at the time they had vending machines in the debriefing room at the squadron office that we were at, and they had a beer vending machine. For a quarter you get a beer. Of course, we'd all drink a beer when we get back, and Andy, he always forget to bring a cup with him, so he'd have to just pour the beer out of the can into his mouth without the lid touching his lips. So that was always kind of funny. And then my boom operator was a Master Sergeant Reed, and he was a good guy too. He was not overly friendly. He was the only enlisted man on the crew, but he seemed to fit in well. We didn't have any issues or problems with somebody pulling rank on him or anything like that. But he was just a nice guy to work with. Of course, we all worked as a team. It was a 4-man crew, and it took all 4 of us to get everything done. So anyway, they assigned us to that crew, and first thing we did was naturally go on alert. Now the way SAC had everything arranged when it comes to your assignments, you would pull alert 7 days straight. You would go on alert like on a Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. And the crew that was replacing you, they'd get off alert, so they would turn their airplane over to us and all the paperwork that we needed to have to show we were responsible for the plane. And then we would stay at this bunker at the end of the runway, about 50 yards away from our aircraft, for 7 straight days, 24 hours a day. We could occasionally maybe slip away to the BX or somewhere like that, but generally you stayed real close to the base because you had to respond. They had a Claxton that was the alert bell would go off, and you had exactly 5 minutes to get from wherever you were at doing whatever you were doing to get out and be on that airplane ready for the next order, which was either start your engines and take off and go to war, or this is just a practice, go back inside, And so we had a lot of alerts. We'd have average probably 2, maybe 3 a week. And sometimes you'd have none, sometimes you'd have 6. You never knew night or day, weekend, whatever, that, when you were going to have one. But if you didn't respond in the time required, all hell broke loose on you. So you didn't want to have that happen to you. So we went on alert for 7 days. The good part was when you get off alert the following Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, they had nothing scheduled for you until most likely the next Monday. So you'd have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday off, and then you would report to duty, and you might, next Monday or Tuesday, you might have a 5-6 hour flight, and you might have another flight a couple days later, and then you might go back on alert the following Friday, because they alternated the alert cycle Wednesdays and Fridays. So if you went on a Friday morning, then you got off the following Friday morning, and then you'd have off Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and they wouldn't plan anything for you till Tuesday. So it was nice. I mean, it was tough, like I say, being in that bunker 24 hours a day, but at the same time, when you got your time off, you could, we would go to Fort Worth, or we'd go different places, or just sit at home and not have anything to do. So it kind of offset the timing fairly well. Late in 1968, we had some crew changes going on. Didn't really want it because I really liked the crew that I was flying with, but the military really doesn't ask you a whole lot of things. They just kind of tell you what's going to happen. But my Major Garrison, he was retiring, and he had his 20 years in, and he was kind of tired. He was ready to retire. So our crew replaced him with a Lieutenant Colonel McCaig, and Colonel McCaig, he was a senior lieutenant colonel, really a nice guy. Everything was by the book, but at the same time, he was a very personable guy, and he and I got along really, really well. We also lost Andy Lebowski. He went off to another assignment, I think B-52s, and we got Major Ken McLaren. He was my navigator the rest of the time that I was in SAC, and he was a practical jokester, and he was all the time pulling jokes on people and doing things which kind of livened up the alert facility, which could be really boring a lot of the time. And the best change, and I like Sergeant Reed, but we lost him, and he went somewhere else, and we ended up with a Senior Master Sergeant, Art Izzo. He reminded me a whole lot of my dad, and he took me under his wing just like my dad would, and showed me the ropes and showed me the do's and the don'ts. And one of my favorite things that he and I used to do whenever we would land somewhere is he'd take me over to the NCO club, because we could get shit on a shingle, SOS, and it couldn't get that at the officers club. And so anytime we had a chance to eat somewhere, he'd grab me and take me with him wherever he was going. And, of course, we used to like, when we went TDY, he'd always like to hit the road and get off base and drink a few beers and go to the jewelry stores and do all that kind of stuff. The surprising part about it was we kept the designation of Crew S101. So I was still the standardization and evaluation Crew S101, which was pretty exciting. I didn't expect that to happen when we lost so many people. But we also added to the mix of our TDYs that we got to go on. They added Goose Bay, Labrador. We enjoyed the time in Thailand because we're fighting the Vietnam War, and we were part of it, and we were helping doing our part in killing all the commies that we could. But we were also in the Cold War, and the Cold War was all Russia, and so we started pulling what they call reflex alert, because it wasn't at your own base, it was at another base, and we went to Goose Bay, Labrador. If you look on a map where that is, if you look all the way to the east coast and then go as far north as you can go without running off the end of the earth, there's Labrador and there's Goose Bay. We'd pull one alert at Altus, and then the next time you were on alert, you'd be in Goose Bay. And the good part about that was, again, being the standardization crew, we got to fly the airplane. And we would take 2 or 3, 4 crews from Altus, and we'd fly up to usually New York, somewhere in New England, to another SAC base, and we'd pick up 3 or 4 crews there and fly them all up to Goose Bay. And when we'd get up there, all the other crews would immediately go on alert, but because we had been flying for 8 or 9 hours, they let us stay off alert until the next morning, which really wasn't that exciting because there wasn't anything to do in Goose Bay anyway. But we got to stay off, and then we'd go on alert the next morning. And we'd be on alert again for a week, and then we'd get off and we'd fly all the crews back to their bases and then fly us back to our bases. And one of the remarks they made to some of the single guys, which I wasn't single at that time, is they said, "You single guys are going to love it up at Goose Bay." He said, "There's a girl behind every tree." And the first time we got up there, we realized what they meant. There weren't no trees. So that took a little wind out of the sails of the single guys, but didn't make any difference to us. We were just doing the same thing we always do. But it was so cold up there. Golly, you can't imagine the wind coming across the north from the North Pole, and the snow. We got about 250 inches of snow every year. And it snows less up there now, but back then it was just heavy every single year. And one of the bad parts is because we had top secret crypto materials on the aircraft that told us when we were going to war and when we were not, based on the information we'd get from the messages. You had to have 2 crew members on the aircraft at one time. You could have no non-crew members any time on that aircraft. So they had a rule, and it was a good rule, that anytime there was an accumulation of 2.5 inches of snow on the wings of your aircraft, the crew had to get up on the aircraft wings and shovel it off with these big rubber-tipped snow shovels. Well, being the youngest guy on the crew, I naturally was on one wing, and my boom operator, who was the only enlisted guy, he was on the other wing. The pilot and the navigator would be on the ground in front of the wing, and they'd tie a rope around their waist. Then they'd throw the rope up to us, and we'd tie it around our waist. And that way, if we slipped and started sliding off the back of the wing, they could stop our fall, so we wouldn't necessarily break our neck. We'd just break an arm or something. And so we would get on the aircraft once the accumulation got too high, and we would start shoveling from one end of the wing all the way down to the end. And by the time, if it was raining or snowing hard like it was a lot of the time, we'd shovel back up the other way. And you'd do that until it quit snowing. And then there was days when we were out there all the time. Plenty of exercise. And of course, we had our parkas and all our heavy equipment on. So, it really wasn't actually cold, but it was just back-breaking work. Well, the good news was, come summer of '69, we got another TDY to go to Thailand, and so again the new crew and we were all excited to get to do that. And so same routine. We took off out of Altus with a replacement engine for the 707, the J57 engine, and about 30 mechanics and crew members and all their tools and bags and everything, and off we went to California, and then Hawaii, and then Okinawa, and then Guam, and then on in to Thailand at Utapao. And so we got over there, and the same routine was going on. The only difference was that all of the F-105s had been replaced with F-4s. The F-4 was supposed to have been a better piece of equipment, could carry more armament, more weight, and was supposedly more maneuverable. And so they switched all of them out. But the same routine went on. We get 4 flights of 4. As soon as we'd get all of them filled up and off to North Vietnam, then they'd be the first ones coming back. And so we'd refuel all of them, and then so we were happy about that. We were getting again a little over 100 hours a month of flying time, and good quality time. Every once in a while we'd get really disappointed because only 3 of the 4 that we sent off to North Vietnam came back. And that was, you could tell on the voices of the crewmen on the fighters how upset they were about it, and we were just as upset as they were. We did have one instance, and this was earlier when we were refueling 105s, where one of them came back. It wasn't our aircraft, it was one of the other aircraft that was over there at Utapao. But they came back from North Vietnam and had a huge hole in the wing right where one of the fuel tanks are. And if the guy was losing fuel, he just barely made it back to the tanker. And the tanker hooked up on him and drug him all the way back to his base in Thailand, pumping fuel into him directly and partially dragging him with the boom. And they let him off on final, and he landed and didn't have to eject out of the aircraft, and the crew was okay. That was, there was a few, like I say, exciting things like that, but a lot of routine, but it was a busy time. But we loved it. And about the only time the military ever made me mad was next thing that happened to me, and that's when Johnson decided we were going to quit bombing the North to give them a chance to rebuild and fight better. And so they sent us home early. We were supposed to have been over there for like 6 months, and we were only over there for 3 months. And so then they sent us back to Altus. It was just suddenly stopped one day. We didn't have any notice or anything. So we flew back to Altus and resumed our normal duties of alert and flying a few hours. But like I said, I was disappointed we didn't get to stay longer and get to finish off the communists that were attacking us all the time. When we got back to Altus Air Force Base from our TDY tour in Thailand, things were pretty rocky at home. Me being gone so much, it was hard on everybody. Nellie Jean was wanting to get a divorce and said she didn't want to be married to somebody that was never home, and I really can't blame her for that. I had plenty of company to keep me occupied, but I don't know what she didn't have as much, just taking care of Debbie and trying to keep the home front going. But things got pretty rocky right then. But just to make it a little more exciting, the government told me, said, we're going to send you to winter survival school in Spokane, Washington. And I said, well, the war we're fighting is a jungle. What do I need to go learn how to survive in winter? And they go, well, don't worry about that. That's not your problem. We just want you to go into this survival school. So they gave me a plane ticket, and off I went to Spokane, Washington, and got up there. It was like middle of February, and we were right on the Washington State and Canadian border. It was cold and wet, but it was also, it'd warm up just enough almost every day from the snow to turn into rain. We would be out there in the rain doing whatever they had us doing, and then at night it would be freezing cold, and so it was pretty miserable conditions. But part of the survival school was to simulate being a prisoner of war, and that was no fun at all. What they did, they took us out one night when it was muddy and rainy and wet and really cold and windy, and put us in an environment like we were in a foxhole in Vietnam, and had us crawling through the mud and shooting blank bullets, I hope they were blanks, at us. And when they got all done with that, they said, okay, you're captured. And they took us down below the ground, and I never did see what it looked like on the outside, but for the next 36 hours or so, we were in a prisoner of war environment. And they would take us from being in a line, question us about what we're over there doing and so forth, see if they get any information out of us, because we didn't know anything, so that was hard for them to do. And then when they get through questioning us, they'd put us in a box that was it's like a foot locker. You couldn't stand up in it. You could kind of hunch over in it, and but you couldn't sit down in it because it was so narrow and so short. And they would put us in there, and they had a hole at the bottom of the box, and if they caught you crouching down too much, they'd take a baton and put it in there and whack you on the shins to make you stand back up again. And what the idea was is to deprive us of any sleep and make us feel like we were real prisoners of war. And like I say, they said it was 36 hours. It seemed like about a week to me. If you sat down and crouched down too much while you were in that little box, or while they had you in there interrogating you, you act like a smart ass instead of being professional like we were supposed to do. Well, then they'd put you in what they call solitary confinement. And I said, well, I was in a box by myself already, But this box was really small. It was like less than 3 foot tall and probably 2 foot square. And I wasn't real heavy then, but I had to really squeeze to get in there. But that was the best time that I had, was in that solitary confinement, because you're crouched down so much that you can actually kind of relax and just go to sleep. And of course, if they caught you doing that, then they'd come over and whack on the box and wake you up and get you moving again. But that went on for like 3 days, and they finally let us out. And, nobody confessed all the sins of the world or anything like that, so we did a pretty good job, all of us. Well, the next trek was like a 5-day trek out in the forest. Again, we don't know exactly where we were, but they would give us a map every day, and they would say, you go from point A to point B, and we're going to have people out there looking for you, and if we catch you, then, you may have to go back and do this thing over again. And, of course, the weather was miserable, rainy and wet and cold and snowy. And before they turned us loose to go on this, and they put us in 2- and 3-man teams, they gave us all a live rabbit. And there was probably 100 of us out there in that group, and everybody was supposed to take the rabbit and kill it and skin it and eat it, cook it and eat it. Well, I like animals, and last thing I ever want to do is eat a rabbit. They also gave us some what they call K rations. They were canned foods that were used. Most of them we had were late World War II and early Korean War, the dates on the cans. So they were good 20-some years old at least. And but they gave us a few cans of those things. And so the first thing I did was I turned around and looked at all these other guys, and they would run off in the woods, and they'd take their rabbit.
What's up, Doc?
Try to beat it to death on a tree, on the tree trunk, and trying to squeeze his neck, and you could hear these rabbits screaming and crying and all that kind of stuff. I said, man, this is horrible. I can't stand this. So I ran further out into the woods, and I turned my rabbit loose. And I said, run, little bunny. Don't let them guys catch you. And so I went back and back to where we were starting out our trip. And I said, well, everybody's trying to cook the rabbit and do stuff like that. Instead of that, I'll try some of these K rations. So I opened up one of the cans. I forget what it said on the can, but it was, like a 1944 model. And took my little can opener, opened up the can, and then I had a little spoon thing, and I started eating. And I said, this stuff ain't half bad. It's a whole lot better than them guys that are trying to eat them dead, raw rabbits that they can't seem to cook right. And so I ate that can, and I said, well, that's pretty good. I think I'll have another one. And so I opened up another can, and I ate that one. It didn't taste quite as good as the first one. And as soon as I finished eating that second can, I had the urge to throw it all up. So I ran out in the woods, and I threw up everything I'd eaten for the last week or so. And I went back. My body was all cleansed, and I was ready for this hike that we were getting ready to go on. So off we went, and I never ate another bite of anything. I took the rest of the K rations just for the thought of them, and I tossed them in a pile, and off on our little trek we went. And me and this other guy, we were both, pretty good shape, so we'd march however far we're supposed to go. And when you get to your encampment, which is supposed to be there, before it gets dark, the first thing you're supposed to do is start a fire. Well, everything in that forest was wet. And so you had to dig the bark off pretty darn deep into that tree in order to get enough dry wood to get your flint to work to light it up where you could start a little fire. But we managed to successfully get a little fire going. It was just so hard to keep it going because of all the wood out there was wet. Once you get a little fire started, you still got to have some dry wood to keep it going. But we managed to get our clothes dry enough, and they gave us these really nice sleeping bags that were really heavy duty, and they were light, but they really were good. And they said, first thing you do, after you get all your clothes dry, is you get the rest of your clothes off. That's where you're naked, and then you climb in your sleeping bag and you sleep. And that worked out pretty good. We didn't have any trouble staying warm and everything all the whole time we were out there, all 4 or 5 days. They had one guy, and he was a staff sergeant. I just briefly talked to him one time, He froze to death. He was a little overweight and wasn't quite good shape as a lot of us. And he got to his encampment, and the other guy was trying to start a fire, and he said, "Man, I'm just so tired." He said, I can't start no fire. I can't do that." So he crawled into his sleeping bag, soaking wet with his clothes, and he didn't wake up the next morning. So they hauled him out of there. And, of course, I made some smart-ass remark. I said, "Well, since a guy died out here, don't you think it's too cold and too bad of weather for the rest of us to stay?" Well, that didn't get too good a response from the sergeant, so we stayed. And anyway, finished up that 5 days, and we finished up my winter survival school. I graduated. I was so cold the whole time I was out there. It was just amazing how you can survive that kind of weather. But we did it. So got back on a commercial plane and flew back to Altus. I had lost 14 pounds from the time I left Altus till I got back. So it was a pretty good diet program. The only thing that happened good on that whole trip was on the commercial flight coming back out of Seattle, Washington. One of the stewardesses looked at me and she said, "You look like you had a pretty rough time." And I explained to her where I was, and she says, "Well, why don't you sit up here in first class?" I said, "You're a military guy." I said, "We got to take care of our military guys." And she brought me one of the first class meals once we got airborne. I ate 2 of those because I hadn't eaten anything in, like I say, 10 days or better. And so that was the best part of the whole trip, but that came to an end. I got home. Then we went back in the same routine again, pulled an alert, and going to Goose Bay and staying at Altus, and things weren't getting any better at home. So Nellie Jean decided she was going to divorce me, and I love Debbie and everything, but she's doing everything she can to keep me from seeing her, and then all of a sudden she wants to give her to me when I'm getting ready to go fly or do something like that, and I don't have any place where I can take her to be safe, because what I was doing is when I had custody of her, once we decided to split up, then I'd take her down to meet Mom and Dad halfway between Fort Worth and Altus, and they'd take her back with her while I was on alert. So a week later, when I'd get off alert, then I'd go back to Fort Worth and get to spend 4 or 5 days with Debbie, and then if I was had a few days I wasn't going to be flying, I'd go ahead and take her back to Altus with me. And if I was going to be doing stuff pretty busy and going back on alert again, I just let her stay in Fort Worth. So it was working out pretty good, but Nellie Jean didn't want her down in Fort Worth. She wanted her back up there. So we were having some issues. So that's when I went over to the base personnel office, and I said, "I need you to do me a favor." I said, "I need you to get me out of here." I said, "I need to go to another base. I don't care where you send me. I don't care what I'm doing. But I don't want to be doing this anymore." And he said, "Well, Captain," he says, "why don't you give me a couple days and give me a number I can call you, and I'll call you when we find out what you're going to be doing next." I said, "That's great." So I left. He called me back the very next day, and he said, "Hey, come on over here. I got something for you." And I went over there to the personnel office, and he says, when I walked in the door, he said, "Captain, you're going to Vietnam." I said, "Really? What am I going to be doing?" And he said, "You're going to fly a fixed-wing gunship." I said, "I don't even know what those are." And he said, "Well, they'll show you that, because they're going to have to go to a couple schools before you end up going over there. And it's going to take, 6 or 8 months before you're actually probably going to be in Vietnam." But he says, "That's where you're going." I said, "Well, okay." I said, "I asked for it. Now I got it." And so I went back doing my routine, and one of the good things that had happened during all of this kind of confusion is I got offered a regular commission. Now, the difference between the reserve commission that I had at the time and a regular commission is the government is telling you that you're an exceptional officer, and they're going to let you stay at least 30 years if you want to, instead of getting out at 20 years like a reserve officer has to. And so I thought that was pretty special. So I got to get my regular commission, and I made captain. And so life was pretty good on the military side of the deal. Before I get into the actual mission that I flew in the fixed-wing gunship, I want to talk a little bit about the aircraft itself. It was designated as a AC-119G attack gunship. And the aircraft that I flew was outfitted with 4 7.62 millimeter rotating barrel Gatling guns. Those guns were mounted on the left side of the aircraft, and the pilot actually pulled the trigger to shoot the guns. The crew consisted of a lot of different people and doing a lot of different functions, but there was a pilot and there was a co-pilot, and then there was a flight engineer. The flight engineer sat right directly behind the console in the center, behind the pilot and the co-pilot. Behind him on the right side, behind the co-pilot, sat one of the 2 navigators. This navigator was we called him the table navigator. And he's the guy that got us to the general area we wanted to be in. He had maps of every area that we had. Of course, the maps were all 30 years old, and so they weren't totally accurate and up to date, but they were close enough that we could use them. But this navigator directed us to the target areas or wherever we needed to go. The second navigator was down in the cargo compartment, and he was the night observation device operator. And what that item was a telescope-looking instrument that hung out one of the doors they had removed, and it was on the left side of the aircraft. And wherever this device was pointed, it showed up on the crosshairs of my pilot screen. And if I pointed the aircraft at the same place where he was pointing this device, then that's where the bullets would go. And we maintained about a 25-degree bank and about 140 miles an hour in this circular pattern, and we could put bullets down. We were authorized to put them down as close as 100 yards from friendly troops, which we were the only fixed-wing aircraft that could shoot that close to friendlies. And a few times, unfortunately, we did. But anyway, back to the aircraft. It was powered by 2 3,350 radial compound piston-driven engines. And these engines had many, many thousands and thousands of hours on them and had been rebuilt more times than you can imagine. And so their performance wasn't up to the specifications of the original design. But so, in fact, we could get maybe 300 to 400 hours per engine before they would either quit running or run poorly or just not run, good enough to keep the aircraft in the air. So they had to be removed and a new rebuilt engine put back on it. Same with the 4-bladed propellers. They had a lot of years on them, and sometimes they would function properly and sometimes they wouldn't. And that was almost, to lose one of those was almost worse than losing an engine, because you didn't have any control over where the power was going and whether it was helping you or pushing you or dragging you. The further back from the guns, there was a illumination device. It looked like one of these lights you see at a car dealership, and this light put out 1.5 million candle power of light. And it had either a white version, which just light up the ground just like it was daytime, or it had an infrared version, which put out kind of a blue light that the night observation device then. His device would amplify that light, and we could see like daytime through his device. Across the back of the plane, on the opposite side, was a flare launcher. It would launch 24 flares. You'd launch them one at a time, and each flare had a parachute on it, and you would drop it upwind from your target area, and it would float down on this parachute and float across the target. So it would illuminate the ground where we could see just like daytime. And that was better to use that than it was the light, because the light also made us shine up in the dark, where the flare illuminated mainly down and didn't leave much of a chance for them to see us up higher. But we would launch those flares, sometimes 6 and 8, 10, 12, rarely ever that many, because we didn't stay on a target that long. But we could, and those guns, the guns were, like I say, 7.62 millimeter, and we could shoot up to 6,000 rounds per minute per gun. that means all 4 guns at high rate could shoot 24,000 rounds a minute. That's a lot of bullets. Now, we normally would not use the 4 guns at high rate very often because we would run out of bullets too quick. Most missions we would carry approximately 40,000 rounds, and we hated to bring any rounds back. And so we looked for targets that we could expend and help our ground people, the Cambodian nationals and the Cambodian army. We would help them suppress the attacks that they were being hit with. There was a few occasions where we did shoot the high rate, and it was very effective when we did. But normally we would use short bursts, and we would pinpoint the target and ask the ground commander, to let us know how our shooting is. And he would call back and say it's good, or move it 100 yards north or south or east or west, whichever. But a very good weapon system, and like I say, we used it very effectively ourselves. To finish out the explanation of all the equipment and personnel on the gunship, in the back of the aircraft there was 2 gunners, and one gunner in particular was a personal friend and a good guy. That was Chris Chrisman, and Chris became my gunner when I first got my first crew, and he stayed with me all the way till I left. And he was really a good kid, a nice guy. And he, in fact, after he got back from Vietnam, he was able to get approved to go to Air Force pilot training. And last I heard from him, he was at Reese Air Force Base going through pilot training. A really, really nice guy. I wish I could get in touch with him again someday if I could just get some help finding him. But the 2 gunners, they kept the guns loaded and made sure the ammunition was ready. And then the other crew member was an illuminator operator, and his job was to keep the generator running to make sure that we had enough electrical power to run the guns and run the light and run the flare launchers and all the other equipment that was on the aircraft. When we were in the firing circle, his job was kind of twofold, because he was the observer to help to identify any ground fire that was coming up, so he could tell us where it was and which way to dodge or which way to shoot. But in his spare time, when he wasn't doing that, he would help the gunners make sure that the bullets were available and everything on the plane was ready to shoot. One last, and we'd call him a part-time crew member, was we had a French interpreter that would fly with us on some of the night missions. The Cambodian ground people, the radio operators especially, they didn't have enough of them, and most of them could all speak English, but they would get some hours off in the middle of the night so they could get some sleep. So they would substitute a Cambodian radio operator, and he could speak Cambodian and he could speak French. So we would need to bring a French interpreter on the plane with us, so that when I was communicating with the ground commander, I would tell the interpreter, and he would translate it into French to the ground radio operator, who took the French that he received and communicated it in Cambodian to the ground commander. And so it's a rather cumbersome way to communicate, and it did slow things down. But when you don't have anybody on the ground that's speaking English, it made it difficult and dangerous not to have somebody that could interpret and tell us exactly what was going on. But many times we found the interpreter a dispensable crew member, because if we couldn't carry 30 to 40,000 rounds of ammunition, then it didn't hardly pay for us to go out and do our job. So if we couldn't carry enough bullets, we'd kick the interpreter off, and we'd add 200 pounds more of bullets, which gave us more to shoot with. Early 1970, I was assigned to fly AC-119G gunships in Vietnam, and I was a little nervous about it, but I was excited at the same time, because I was actually going to get to go see some war action. But first I had to go to a couple of schools up in Ohio. The first one was in Wilmington, Ohio, a little bitty town near Cincinnati that was a reserve Air Force base. Nobody in active duty was flying that aircraft anymore. So I decided I wanted to take Debbie with me, even though Mom and Dad, really wanted to watch her. And I said, no, I haven't been around her the first 3 years of her life. And when I go over there for a year and I may or may not come back, I wanted to spend as much quality time with her as I could. So reluctantly, they let me take her with me, and we headed off to Wilmington, Ohio, and we got up to this little bitty town. Housing was horrible. There was no rent houses. Anybody that had anything to rent and rented it, 6 months or a year at a time. And there was also hardly any daycare places. So I had one last stop at a rent house, and they said, no, we only rent for, long term. And I said, well, I'm getting pretty desperate. I said, instead of finding a place to live, I said, I guess if I could just find a daycare, I could sleep in my car if I had to, And they said, oh, there's a lady down the street here that she takes care of kids at her house. You can go visit with her. So I went down the street, and sure enough, big old white house and a bunch of little kids running around in the backyard. And so I went up and asked her, I said, I'm looking for a daycare, someone to take care of my daughter while I'm going to flight school here at the Clinton County Airport and getting ready to go to Vietnam. And I said, I can't find a place to live, and I can't find anybody that will watch my daughter. And she said, well, I watch kids, but she said, I'm kind of filled up right now. I really don't plan on taking any more children in. And she said, I also have an apartment upstairs, but we only rent it out for longer term, 6 months or a year. And I said, well, you're my last resort. I said, is there any way you could reconsider? And she said, well, let me talk to my husband when he comes home tonight, and we'll see what we can do. So just come back by here tomorrow, and we'll let you know. So I went back. This was Saturday. I went back on Sunday, late morning. I didn't know if they went to church or not, but they didn't. And so I went up and talked to him, and the lady said, well, since you're going to Vietnam and you're fighting for our country, and we'll do you a favor, and I'll watch your little girl, and we'll rent you that apartment upstairs for however long you're in that school. So I was naturally elated that we could all do it at one spot, and it did end up really, really a good situation. The lady was really nice, and I'd take Debbie down there in the morning on my way out to fly, and she'd watch her all day, and then in the evening time, I'd get home, and Debbie and I get to spend 3 or 4 or 5 hours together, getting to know each other, and just had a really, really good time. And the school lasted about 3 months, and so it worked out really, really well. I finished that school, and then I had to go up to Columbus, Ohio, to Lockbourne Air Force Base, and that was where we were going to. I already learned to fly the plane. Now I learned how to shoot the guns, and that school again was about 3 months long. Again, couldn't find temporary housing. I did find a daycare at the air base, and they said they could watch Debbie, during the day while I'm flying. I said, well, also another situation, I said, we're going to be doing some night flying up here, and 2 of the ladies that worked at the daycare said, we'll help you out. Says, we'll just take her home with us, and you can come get her when you get back from flying, whatever time it is. So that worked out really good, but again, I couldn't find a place to live. I ended up moving into the Holiday Inn, and that worked out pretty well for me too, though. And so I had a good place for Debbie to stay, and lived in the Holiday Inn where I didn't have to make my bed or do anything. It was all taken care of. And my per diem that I was making each day just about covered the cost of the room, so we were pretty good shape. So anyway, but I was going through the training and everything was going well, and the lady that ran the daycare, she would watch her occasionally at night, and so that worked out okay. And then the lady that was the innkeeper at the Holiday Inn, she kind of befriended more Debbie than me, but she said, there's no reason for you to have to stay here at this hotel paying, these high prices, which is like $30 a night or something like that. She says, why don't you and your daughter just move in with me, and I'll take care of her, from daycare, after she gets out of daycare when you have to fly at night, and that way it'll be good for all of us. So she had 2 children, a little older, like about 7 and 10, I guess were their ages. But it turned out to be really nice. She was really a nice girl, and we got along real well. And Debbie had a more of a home life than she did, hanging around the hotel with me. But one of the highlights of my time at Lockburn was one of the instructors kind of took a liking to me, and he kind of gave me special attention and extra good hints and tips on how to keep from killing myself or the airplane from killing me. And one of the things that he told me, he says, the specifications on this for takeoff speed, rotation speed, and all this here is going to vary somewhere around 120 to 140 knots is what you're going to be taking off at. He says, add 10 knots to that speed, and he said that could save your life. He said because these planes do not perform well at all under the weight conditions that you're going to be flying and under the temperature conditions, because it's going to be very hot and very muggy, which hurts the performance of the engine. And he said, so just add 10 knots to every number and you'll be safe. And then, of course, I went and took my final check ride from this same guy, and he put me first to do the shooting of the guns, which I did a pretty good job hitting the target and everything. And there was 3 of us students all taking our check ride the same day. And he gave the other 2 guys a chance to shoot the guns, and then we got ready to come back and land. And he said, Vanover, he says, you get up here, I want you to do the first approach. And so I got up there in the left seat, and I'm driving along, and he said, okay, he said, we're going to do what they call a back course ILS, which means you have beacons that come up and show on instruments in the cockpit that tell you to turn left or right or go higher or lower to stay on the glide path to land, except when you do a back course, you're on the opposite side, so all of those gauges are backwards, and which is a challenge. But I got it all lined up, and I was headed right down the track on final approach, and he said, this is too easy. So he pulled one of the engines and shut it off. He didn't shut it off, he pulled it to idle. And he said, let's make it a little harder on you. Let's see what you're going to do with one engine out. And so I naturally grabbed the yoke and pushed the rudder and kept it straight, and we run on right down the same glide path. Everything worked out great. And that'll come back to help me a lot once I got over in country. But anyway, so we left there, and we ended up going back to Fort Worth for a couple of weeks before I had to report to get on the plane to go to Vietnam. And so I had a nice time with Mom and Dad, and of course Debbie and I had gotten pretty close and got to know each other, and so that was pretty wonderful for me. So anyway, I got finished, and Mom and Dad took me over to Love Field and put me on a aircraft to California. I think I went out to Sacramento, and they had a contract carrier load about 250 of us on an aircraft that should have held about 200. And they flew us from California to Alaska, and it was Thanksgiving Day that we took off. And so we had turkey dinner on the plane, and we got up to Alaska, and they let us off and refueled the plane. We got back on and went to Japan. Well, it was still Thanksgiving, so we had turkey dinner there too. And so we got to eat turkey twice. We landed in Japan, and unbeknownst to us on the plane, there was an aircraft that took off about 6 hours after we did, following the same track, same full of GIs like me. And it took off out of Alaska and crashed and killed everybody on the plane. And of course, we didn't have any clue that that had happened. But Mom and Dad and other people were all making these frantic calls to airlines and airports and everything, thinking that I may have got killed on that plane. And they finally got through to me by the time I got to the Philippines. And of course, we still didn't know that had even happened, but I reassured them that I was not dead, I was still alive, and everything was good. But that was one of the items, one of the things that happened to me, almost got me killed before I even got in country. When we got to the Philippines, we had about a 2-week jungle survival school, and that was kind of a strange thing. They took us in helicopters out in the middle of the Philippine jungle, which is really jungle, and they had these little negretos, local natives that lived out there in the jungle, and the military paid them to help catch us. They set us off on a track from point A to point B, and we were not supposed to be caught. And if we got caught, we had a little puncher, and the Negreto pygmy guy, he had a card, and we had to punch his card if he caught us. And every time he caught somebody, he got 10 pounds of rice. So that's what these guys lived on. And so they were really serious about finding us, because that meant whether they were eating or not. And fortunately, went through the whole thing and never got caught one time. One of the funny things is the guy that was in one of the instructors was telling us, at nighttime, there's about a packed 3 feet of dead leaves all over the entire jungle. And we're supposed to crawl down under the leaves and sleep at night, so we wouldn't be found by the enemy. And they just got through telling us about an hour before that all of the poisonous snakes and all of the rats, that's where they lived, was underneath all those leaves. And so I asked them, I said, hey, didn't that where you tell us where the snakes and the rats are, and we're supposed to sleep with them? I said, I'd almost rather get caught. And he said, well, no, you can't. You don't get caught, because you get caught, you're going to have to go back and do this all over again. So anyway, but we made it through. Only one guy had a little injury. He had a rat bite him on the lip. He had eaten some of his rations that they gave him, and he didn't clean his lips and mouth off. And some rat came up while he was sound asleep and bit him on the lip. So they medevaced him out of there, give him rabies shots and all that kind of stuff. But he managed to live. So one of the other things that happened, a second near-death experience, was while we were staying at these off-base quarters, because there were so many people going through Clark Air Force Base at the time. They didn't have enough quarters on base, so they put us in a kind of a hotel-like thing off base. And I was getting ready to go eat dinner with a couple of guys that I was with one afternoon, and I was walking down this outside hallway, trees all over on one side and the building on the other side. And I turned the corner, and I took about 6 steps, and I could kind of sense motion behind me. And I turned around and immediately saw this Filipino with a 3-foot-long sword ready to chop my head off. Fortunately, he was about 6 foot away from me when this happened, and I guess I startled him by turning around, and he startled me by, just emotion. But he turned around and ran. So that was the second near-death experience that I had even before I got in country. Needless to say, we didn't walk out of our room unless there was 2 of us walking together, so we could kind of guard each other. But after that was all over, then we headed off, got on another plane and flew down from Philippines to Saigon. And the base that I was going to be assigned to was right there in Saigon, Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base. And so I got off the plane and got checked into where I was supposed to go, and they told us, who to report to and so forth, and they gave us our quarters, and it was really nice. All of us flight crew people, we had individual rooms, like a hotel room in a 3-story concrete building. And every room had its own air conditioner, and had bed and couch and chairs and tables, and we had maid service. Maid service was great because they would shine your shoes, they wash your clothes, they make your bed, wash your sheets, anything that you needed, and it was $5 a week is what it cost you. So that was anyway. So I got checked in and went on over to the base and to the operations, and they assigned me to fly as a co-pilot on this one particular crew. And so I went back, got a little sleep, and then showed back up for the bus time. And so my first mission in Vietnam was flying as a co-pilot. But they told me, they said you're going to have your own crew. It's going to take us 3 days to put together your flight crew, but you're going to be a pilot right off the bat. And a lot of the guys that were there, all of them started out as co-pilots and stayed as co-pilots for a while. And I found out later that my check ride that I had taken at Lockbourne, the instructors all pumped me up about how good it was, and that helped me get to have my own crew right off the bat. So it wasn't 3 or 4 days after I got over there that I had my own crew put together, and I became Shadow 26. The first mission I went out on was, again, as a co-pilot. We got in a firefight with some pretty heavy armament from the ground. They were shooting all kinds of 50 caliber and 20 millimeter cannons and some kind of rocket. I don't even know what they called it, but one of them went right between my cockpit seat and our right engine. I don't know how it kept from hitting the prop or the wing or the fuselage, but you could see the smoke and hear the sound of the rocket propelled thing, whatever was making it go, and it went right on by my window, and I thought to myself at the time, I said, gee, if this is what combat's like, I'm going to earn every penny of that $180 or whatever it was they were paying me every month. I want to continue this story with some of the more exciting missions while I was over there. One of the first things that happened, kind of scary, was we took off out of Tonsanut, and it was a night mission. And we're flying along in the dark, and of course, when you're flying, we're not but 2,500 feet above the ground, so we were pretty low. You never flew with any lighting. Most of the time, when you're regular flying, you have lights on each wing, and you got lights on the tail, and you got lights underneath and on top. Well, when we were over there, you only flew with the top beacon lit, so the people on the ground couldn't see you. And we had our top beacon on. And it was pretty clear that night, and we were just, driving along, headed out to Cambodia, and all of a sudden I was kind of looking outside, and the co-pilot, a guy named Ralph Lafarth, he was my co-pilot and was for quite a while, but he and I were flying together that night, and he and I both at the same time, we saw a red light flicker, and I reached over and turned the landing lights on, and when I turned them on, I could see another aircraft coming exactly straight for us, and it was a C-47, another old prop-driven plane, and it was being flown by Vietnamese. Luckily, both me and the Vietnamese pilot broke hard left. And how we missed each other, how we missed clipping wings or running head on, it's a miracle. But we had a near miss, and of course everybody in the back of the plane started yelling, "Hey, what are you doing? You're trying to hurt us," and all this kind of stuff. And we explained to them that we just had a near head-on collision, and we actually just saved everybody's life. And but that really made you realize that you can't take a second off of full focus on what you're doing, otherwise you might end up dead. I mean, if we'd hadn't reacted the way we did, we'd have hit and would have taken all of us out without even knowing what happened. So that was pretty exciting. Another mission, which I'm kind of proud of, is we were named the Shadow Shooter of the Week. They had a white chalkboard posted in operations, and every week somebody that did something a little extra, would get his name up there and his crew names up there. Well, I was out flying. Actually, it was for my instructor rating so I could teach other people to be the pilot in the 119. And a Colonel Strickland was our instructor. He was a mean old lieutenant colonel, but he was fair, but he was just really harsh and direct to the point. He didn't sugarcoat anything. So he was in the jump seat, and we were out talking to ground commanders in Cambodia, looking for some action. And one of the navigators was on the night observation device, and he had it focused out on the area, looking for campfires or engine heat or anything like that, which that device would pick up. And he says, "Pilot," he said, "I just have spotted multiple campfires located in that forest, and he said, I can't tell how many. There's just so many." Well, Colonel Strickland says, "Break off to the right immediately." So I broke off, and we flew away like we didn't see anything. And we called every ground commander. We called clear back to Tan Son Nhut to make sure there were no friendly troops in that area, and we were assured that there were no friendly troops in there. If there was anybody there, it was bad guys. And so we turned back around and flew back toward the target. One of the things when we were flying in the firing circle, you had to keep the engine RPM up high, and the exhaust flame was sticking out about 2 feet behind each engine. There was 3 exhausts on each corner of the engine, and there was fire coming out because you're running at high RPM. And so we didn't want them to see that, so we climbed up about 300, 400 feet so we could kind of coast into the firing circle. And the NOS, he focused on the campfires, and wherever he pointed that night observation device, it showed up on my crosshairs. And if I lined up the aircraft crosshairs with his, then he was pointing where I was going to shoot. And so we rolled in, and we had all 4 guns at high rate, which meant we were shooting 24,000 rounds a minute. And of course, you couldn't shoot that very long because we didn't have but about 50,000 rounds on us maximum. But we rolled in on the target, and I did several bursts, but we ended up expending probably 35,000 rounds in a couple of minutes. We circled the target one time, and the night observation navigator kept saying, "I see sparks, and I see ricochets, and I see bigger fires." And with the naked eye, me looking through the eyepiece, I could see some explosions and things like that going on. So I know we hit something pretty good. And so we expended what we were going to expend, and then we pulled off the target because we figured we probably made them mad and they're going to shoot back at us. And so we flew on off, and like I say, we were about out of bullets, so we didn't stay in country that much longer. We went on back home. We didn't know, whether we'd done good or whether it was possible we shot some good people. We don't know that. So the next day we show up for our flight again, and somebody says, "Hey, come in here and look at the board." And we went in there, and under Shadow Shooter of the Week, there was Shadow 26 was the Shooter of the Week, that we had 600 confirmed kills. The Cambodian friendly troops had gone into that area that morning and confirmed that we had gotten a big regiment of North Vietnamese, and they were all camped out. They were headed south to create damage for us. So I was pretty proud of the effect that we had and on our shooting that particular day. So that worked out well. And there's just things like that. You never know whether you're shooting the right people or the wrong people. I know if you shot the wrong people, you go up for court-martial, and that wasn't a good thing to happen. So we didn't like that. But we had another incident that I'm kind of, again, proud of, that I want to brag about a little bit, is one evening we were getting ready to take off, and I had a brand new co-pilot they had just sent in there, and he was going to fly his first mission with my crew. And so we went out and we did the engine run up, and everything looked good on the engine, and flight engineer, he said everything's good. So we pulled out on the runway, and we run the engines up and release the brakes, and off we roll. And this brings me to that instructor that I had at school that said, add 10 knots to your takeoff speed. Well, I had done that on every takeoff that I'd had done since he told me that. And I did the same thing that afternoon. It was a late afternoon takeoff. As soon as we lifted off, I called for gear up. The co-pilot would go over and flip the switch to make the gear come up while I had my hands on the throttles and the yoke. As soon as the gear started up, the right engine shut off completely. And of course, you notice an immediate yaw turn toward the dead engine because you got all the power coming out the left side and no power on the right side. Not only that, we had the drag of the flaps were still down and the gear was still coming up, and the hydraulics only had half the system to make all this stuff work. The flight engineer, McCormick, super guy, saved our life that day. He and I both grabbed the bad throttle. We said, okay, we're going to pull the bad throttle back to see if it changes anything that what we're doing to confirm that is the bad engine. We did, and nothing changed. So we left it off, and I says, Mac, feather the prop. Well, all of a sudden, this brand new co-pilot, he starts trying to grab throttles and this, that, and the other. And Mac and I both slapped his hand and said, don't touch nothing, just sit there. And I was struggling to keep the aircraft straight because as soon as you turn it a little bit sideways with all the doors and windows that are no longer on the aircraft because you got guns sticking out of them and night observation devices and lights and all this kind of stuff, that would be like throwing a sail out to stop you. But I kept the aircraft straight, and we only made it. We were about 100 feet, I guess, by the time that the engine, shut down. The prop didn't want to feather because the hydraulics were real slow, so we had a lot of drag. But eventually, the prop straightened out. The gear finally came up, and we weren't losing altitude. We were about 100, 150 feet in the air, and we got the flaps up, and I just went straight out because I wanted to get more airspeed. But if I hadn't had that extra 10 knots of airspeed, we'd have crashed right at the end of the runway because there would have been no way we could have kept. I sacrificed some of the extra 10 knots airspeed in order to get a little more altitude, and that saved us. So we're driving out, and I'm yelling at my gunners, throw out all the heavy stuff. So we threw all the bullets out. We threw out all of the flares. We had 16 flares, and they all weighed probably 30 pounds apiece. And we had about 40,000 rounds of ammunition. They threw all of those out. And anything else that wasn't tied down, in fact, one of the gunners, he called up, he said, pilot, you want me to throw the parachutes out? And I said, no, we're not going to use them because we're too low, but it's going to take too much paperwork if we have to fill out and explain why we threw parachutes out of a plane. So he said, okay. So we finally managed to, the flight engineer, McCormick, he was keeping the engine hot, but if you get it too hot, you lose power. And they have these cowlings that are on the outside of each engine, and you can open them and close them like you're allowing radiator air to go through. And if you keep them open too much to keep the engine cool, then it causes drag, so it slows you down. But if you have them too closed, then you don't have the drag, but the engine gets too hot and you lose performance that way. So McCormick was working those cowlings open and closed, and he said, pilot, I don't know how long we can keep this engine running at the temperature that we're at. So I slowly turned it to the right, and we headed back toward the base. We made it all the way back to final, and we were still only like 200 feet in the air. And the next important issue was lowering the gear, because once you start lowering the gear, you increase the drag, which is going to increase your rate of descent. And if you drop them too soon, you're not going to have enough to get to the runway. If you drop them too late, you're going to be ready to land on the ground and your gear's not down. Well, luckily, the timing worked out almost perfect. We put the gear down, and the two main gear locked in. We were probably not 20 feet in the air, but the nose gear didn't. And I had one of the gunners, he was looking through this little sight hole where he could see the nose gear, and he kept saying, it looks like it's down, it looks like it's down, but on our gauges, it didn't show it was down, it didn't show green. And just as I touched the main gear down, and I was holding the nose up because I didn't know if it was down or not, the impact from hitting the ground pushed the nose gear, and it locked in gear, and we got 3 green. And so then we had all 3 gear and down, and we landed on the roll, and we got back safe and sound. Now, this had happened to 2 other aircraft in the past, and in those 2 instances, everyone on board just about was killed every time. There's just no way that the plane could fly at the weight that we were at on one engine. Well, something above us was looking down on us and protecting us because we made it through and brought the plane back. That was probably the closest I've been to death ever. And like I say, you're right in the middle of it, and everything kind of in a way goes in slow motion, but at the same time it was moving pretty fast. Everything was happening quick. But I'm so thankful that we lived through that. I'm so thankful that the flight engineer, McCormick, was able to keep that engine running with all the power we could get out of it. The only other thing about that flight was I had the Squadron commander, a guy named Tommy Teal. He was a colonel, and he's a nice old boy, but he never did check out as a pilot. He couldn't pass the check ride to be a pilot, and he'd been a pilot for 30 years probably, but he just couldn't pass his check ride. So in order for him to get his combat pay, he had to get at least 4 hours of combat time every month. So he'd jump on somebody's other plane and ride in the jump seat. And right after we lost the engine, Colonel Teal got on the intercom, and he says, "Hey pilot," he says, "are we going to crash?" And I calmly as I could, I said, "Well, Colonel, I'm going to try my best not to crash. I'm doing all I can." And he never said another word, but he was all of us were kind of crying when we got back on the ground. It was, like I say, it was a miracle that we lived through that. But I was happy it happened that way, and I'm happy that I'm still alive. A couple other instances that I find interesting, I hope everybody that's listening to this will find interesting, is we had some pretty inclement weather at times in Vietnam. It was basically a rainforest, and we had severe fog, we had severe heavy rains, gusty winds. We had a lot of conditions that really weren't good for flying. For example, we had 4 or 5 instances where the visibility was 0. That was generally early in the morning when it had been raining all night and the moisture was 100%. And fog was so thick we could not see the taxi. And what they would have to do is they would put a guy with a high-intensity flashlight on the back of a Jeep, and he would lead us out of the revetment onto the taxiway, and then he would lead us down the taxiway with his white light because we could not see markers on the parkway, or we couldn't see the lights on the side of the taxiway.
Steve, I want every light you can get poured onto that field. Being done right now.
And he would lead us out to the runway, and then we would stop and we'd do our run-ups and check our engines and check everything, make sure it's all ready to go. And then he would lead us out onto the runway. And he would get us lined up, dead center, headed down the runway, and then he would get out of the way. And so when we released brakes, ran the engines up and released the brakes, we virtually could see 10 feet in front of us. We couldn't see the side markers. We couldn't see the white stripes down the middle. Couldn't see any of the lights on the sides of the runway. But we would hold that heading, and of course our eyes were intently looking, trying to see something to make sure we didn't run over some landing lights or something. and we would get that landing roll out of the way and raise the nose. As soon as the gear came up, we knew we were safe. But before that point, all the way down the runway, the 3,000 or 4,000 feet that we rolled, we were just rolling blind and hoping that we were staying close enough to the center of the runway that we didn't run off of it. And so that was kind of scary. Another instance, this happened in landing, was they had some monsoon type rains. I mean, just heavy, heavy, heavy. And we had come back from a mission. It was a daytime mission again. And we had lined up on final. And of course, the tower was telling us that, got about 100, 200 feet visibility, but the thunderstorm had just moved away from the runway, but there was a lot of water on the runway. So we made a good landing, smooth landing, and I reached over to pull the propellers back to idle and then back into reverse. When I did that, the left engine did not reverse. It just stayed in idle. And because the runway was so wet, we immediately turned sideways. And I was looking at the runway out the side window. And of course, immediately I pushed the reversed throttle back into neutral, and we straightened out. But I had hard rudder and like I say, some aileron and rudder use to get us back straight. But we went down that runway probably 100 yards sideways. If we'd hit a dry spot, the plane would have tumbled over, or we could have just skidded off the runway into the mud. But thank goodness we kept it close enough onto the runway. By the time we got it straightened back out, we made a normal stop and taxied off. But that could have turned out really, really bad if we hadn't have been lucky. And like I said, I'd rather have luck than skill any time when I'm flying an airplane. One last item I'd like to talk about was in the last 6-8 weeks of my tour in Vietnam, I was designated as one of the instructor pilots to teach the Vietnamese how to do our mission that we were flying. That was kind of semi-successful, which I'll explain why, but we would take Vietnamese Air Force crews who had many, many thousands of hours flying the C-119, because that was a plane that the Vietnamese used extensively in their part of the war. For us, they mainly carried cargo and people from one point to another, but many of the pilots that I taught had 10 to 20,000 hours of flying time in this 119, so they knew how to fly the plane extremely well. What they didn't understand and didn't know how to do was how to shoot the targets that we were aiming at and to be aggressive enough to protect the ground people. So we started out our missions. We would, on an instructor crew, we would have an instructor pilot, we'd have an instructor navigator, and we'd have an instructor gunner. And that was the instructor crew for the Vietnamese. And again, most of them, they knew their job except for the shooting part. So I would let the Vietnamese pilot take off and fly out to the area, and then he would use my call sign to call the ground commander, the Cambodian ground commander, to see if we could, he could use any of our help. And unfortunately, the Cambodian ground commander, he recognized the Vietnamese voice as not being mine, Shadow 26, and most of the time when we would say we're available, the Cambodian ground commander said, "Oh, no, we're fine. We don't have any problems. Thank you for coming by and have a nice day," and go on. And about half the time at least, I would get on the radio myself and I'd say, "Hey, whatever the ground commander's call sign was, this is Shadow 26. Are you sure you can't use our help?" And, "Oh yeah, Shadow Gene, we can use your help." Says we give you the geographic coordinates for where we are and where the enemy is, and if you can put bullets down on them and chase them away, we would be happy. And they just did not trust, the Cambodians did not trust the Vietnamese for probably multiple reasons. We never did really learn out all the reasons, but it was enough to know that they weren't going to be that successful unless they changed their attitude toward each other. And so then we would get the the Vietnamese to go roll into the firing circle and try to put some bullets down. And unfortunately, a lot of the times when we would start shooting down at the ground, well, the ground would start shooting back at us because they didn't want us killing them. And as soon as we could see some tracers coming up toward the plane, usually the Vietnamese pilot would say, "Okay, pilot said we shoot our guns, we go home now." And I go, No, we shoot back. You shoot where the bullets come at you. And so it took quite a bit of convincing to get them to be aggressive enough to drive the enemy back and help our ground commanders. So, but I enjoyed doing it in a way because it was nice, being able to teach these Vietnamese better how to defend themselves, because we knew we were all getting ready to go home. This was toward the middle of 71, and the war was definitely winding down, and we were turning our entire mission over to the South Vietnamese Air Force. My last mission that I flew in Vietnam, we had a fairly successful run, and we were on our way back, and I, using the intercom, called up to the Vietnamese pilot, and I said, "Hey, pilot," it says, "this is my very last mission in a gunship and my last mission in the Air Force. I'm going back to the States next week." And I said, "Would you mind if I landed the aircraft?" And this major that was the Vietnamese pilot, "Oh, yes, sir." He says, "Please come up here." He said, "I'll unbuckle and you can have the seat." And so he got out and I jumped in the seat. And I had not really flown in probably 6 weeks of driving the plane myself. And so I wanted to make this last landing a good one. And so we had good weather. That it was a daytime mission. The weather was good, no bad winds or no storms or rain or anything like that. We brought it around final approach, and I had everything set just right. The Vietnamese co-pilot, he just sat there in the seat. He didn't ever talk much. He didn't have much responsibility. His job was to raise the gear, lower the gear, raise the flaps, and lower the flaps, and that was his only job. And so we came in, and I made probably the best landing I'd ever made in a 119. So smooth that the people in the back of the plane didn't even realize we were really on the ground until we put the props in reverse and slowed down. So I was really proud of my last attempt to land this gunship that I had found a lot of fun and a lot of love for.